This reading to me is a solid reminder to take no moment for granted. It is the poor who suffers the most. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian. As a 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. So we're in chapter 13 of Mark. And we have Jesus using some very strong, very apocalyptic language. And I mean, painting a real scary picture, to be frank. Because he says things like, in those days after the time of distress, there'll be things like the sun darkening and the moon losing its brightness and stars falling from the sky. And in order that people will see the Son of Man coming in glory and power with all the angels to gather everyone from all over. And he says, take the fig tree as a parable. Use the fig tree as an example. You could see when it becomes rich and you know when it's most fertile. You know that summertime coming. Same way too, when you read the scene and see all these signs, know what to expect. But at the end of the day, the only one who knows the exact moment when all this will happen is the Father. Nobody else knows. Now, preparing for this week's reflection, I would have had a dream that I imagine 99.9% sure would have been caused through reading this story, because I would read stories over and over and ponder and contemplate and reflect on it, right? The unfortunate thing is, though, this dream that I would have had, so same like all last week, I said I wasn't well. This week I'm not back to 100 yet, but we get in there. So one of those nights of being unwell, I had a dream that, unfortunately, is a living nightmare for a lot of people throughout the world. So in this dream, what happened is that we were deep into this world war. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, we lost a few resources. Well, we no longer had access to a few resources. Well, and one of them was flour. And, well, another was also wine too. But the thing is, we lost items that would help us consecrate, that what we use to consecrate that Mass, right? And it felt like the world ran out of grace in the dream. Now, of course, it's kind of silly to think about it, right? Because, of course, God's grace goes way beyond the items that we use for our own rituals. But also, of course, because I am a Catholic, I do see the world through a Catholic lens. So in the dream, it felt like grace ran out because we are so dependent on the sacraments and we so prize our sacraments and value them as a source of grace. Now, thankfully, God's grace, at least as far as we have experienced and as far as we trust, is infinite. And God's grace never runs out. God's grace goes way beyond any religion or in any religious tradition. God's care for the God's mercy, God's love continues to flow regardless, no matter what. But this story makes me feel like, where is God's grace in this too? It's in the midst of everything, though, as we would read. It's like everything that we rely on for humans as consistent, as humans, the things that we rely on for consistency too, the things like the sun rising and setting and the moon and its periods and all that in this story just goes completely berserk. It's just so much chaos and drama. And this comes, like Jesus is saying, after the time of distress. You know, he's not saying that this is the time of distress. He's saying that this is after the time of distress, as if this wasn't distressing enough. And I could say, when I look at this here, this is what it feels like, that life and the world has gotten where it feels like the sky has fallen. And yet I could say the same thing about last year. I could say the same thing about the year before that. And I could say the same thing about the year before that. And I could say that for probably about every year that I've been around to experience. And it's like, when I talk to people who've been here even longer, it seems like they themselves might have very similar ways of describing it. Where, excuse me, it seems like the world is progressing towards more and more of a disastrous state. Now, of course, we have many different interpretations as to why, and of course, we have many different religious interpretations as to why things seem that way. And even though science shows us that it seems like the world is actually progressing more towards unity and harmony, the way things feel, it feels like the opposite, that things are moving more towards disaster. So this reading to me is a solid reminder to take no moment for granted, to take nothing for granted, to cherish the good moments in particular, to cherish the moments of enjoy, to cherish the moments of peace, to cherish the moments where life feels like grace and all of its fullness. Because as we know, as all of us know, life has so much volatility, and we never know when it might feel like the cosmos is falling apart. But more than that, more than this story being a reminder for me to cherish all moments and to just cherish the good especially, it just makes me wonder. And anybody who knows me personally knows how I feel about the environment and the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing. So it just makes me wonder, like how Jesus said here, for example, use the fig tree as a parable. And what I'm about to say here sounds extremist, and I am speaking in hyperbolic terms. But what happens when we no longer have any trees to observe? What happens when we no longer have the fig tree to take as a parable? Because the way we're destroying the earth and all the different consequences that come with that, what happens when we no longer have the animals to observe, or the insects, or the different plants? I mean, all the different species that we are driving to extinction at, to be honest, a very stupid accelerated rate. And I hate to sound like a climate doomer, really, I do. Like, I don't want to be that guy. But I can't help but feel like one when I take a look at the situation for what it is. And I just feel like, besides the climate crisis being a dilemma in itself, I feel like it also puts us in a dilemma where we have a choice to choose between profits and choose between people. And more often than not, if not always, we end up choosing the profits, the monetary value, over the people. And at the end of the day, it is the poor who suffers the most. And I mean, we see it time and time again, right? Through any natural disaster or any kind of disaster that happens, it's the poor who always suffers the most, and in a disproportionate way to people who have resources to be able to weather any kind of different storms that might come their way. The poor is always who suffers the most. The marginalized are the most affected and become even more marginalized and more disenfranchised. And, you know, the thing is, there's this narrative that the developing countries are largely to blame for so many of the carbon emissions. I mean, so many people blame Trinidad and Tobago too in particular. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that developing countries should seek progress at the cost of any sort of care or concern for the environment, because that's what got us into this mess in the first place. But what I'm saying is, there's also the other narrative, and it seems like this is actually the more real and authentic narrative, that the majority of the carbon emissions are coming from the developing countries. And they try to blame and make it seem like, oh, well, no, it's not us. When clearly it seems like, no, I mean, it's the carbon emissions are coming from the countries that consider themselves to be so developed and so perfect, for lack of a better term. I don't know, that narrative is just very hard for me to stomach or to accept as authentic. And so, for example, while currently shooting this video, we are having the COP gatherings. You know, we have the COP gatherings every year. And in these gatherings, we have the world leaders or the representatives of these nations flying into these conferences on their private jets or using the opportunity of their time being together to facilitate more fossil fuel deals. instead of actually working toward it, trying to limit the warming of the earth and actually try to care for and to save the environment like they're supposed to be doing. And it's very difficult to believe in these cases and in these causes when there is so much evidence of, I suppose, a reality of not caring for the earth the way we say that we do. And we have so many young people who are activists and who are protesting. I mean, we have activists and protesters across so many different age groups, right? But in particular, we have young people who are begging for change because it is the youth who will be the ones who inherit the damaged earth. And yet it feels like these cries fall on deaf ears, or, to be honest, ears that might hear. I just simply don't care. Seems like anytime there's a choice between prophets and people, we choose prophets and discard people. So, for all of this apocalyptic language that Christ has in this story here, I still let it happen. I mean, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say this. Let it happen. And let all the wonders and signs that Jesus is talking about, let it come to pass. Because in that, like Jesus says in the story, in that is where we see God. In that is where we experience the Son of Man coming. And I mean, me personally, I wouldn't necessarily espouse the idea of this dramatic Jesus coming back in the clouds in a literal sense with trumpets and horns blasting. I mean, who's to say, right? But that wouldn't be my first guess or my first thought. But if there's one thing I believe that we can trust in, is God's word. And if there's one thing I can trust, is that God is able to come through us. Because God, if we believe that God is with us and God has made God self-incarnate, then God is able to come the way Jesus is talking about here in this story, but through us, through the people. Because I feel like it's only God could really change these bad situations and bring about goodness in all the bad and bring about order through all the chaos and bring about grace through all the disaster. But the way God is able to do that is through us. And it reminds me of the words of, one of our great mystics, Teresa of Avila, who she would say that God has no hands and feet, etc., but ours. So let God make God's self manifest in all of us who are willing. Let God be in those of us who want to see positive change and who want to be positive change. Let God come forth in us so that we can be the ones to create the change. And once we could do that, even when the sky feels like it's falling, we can trust that God's grace will never run out. And doesn't. Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.